Welcome to multiple choice question 22 of the 2007 Mathematical Methods Exam 2. In this video we will be looking at the solution for this question. A reminder that this video is in no way endorsed by VCAA. Now before we move on to the problem, I'd just like to point out that the use of the CAS calculator is not really appropriate for this question. Instead it's something that you've got to reason through. The other thing that I'll point out, just looking at this graph, is that this question's a little bit more reminiscent of the old study design where this exam question comes from, because it's actually got an absolute or modulus value graph in there. However, we can still tackle this problem just using reason and logic. So getting onto the problem, we have the graphs of y equals f of x and y equals g of x are shown. And we're asked that the graph of y equals f of g of x, so the composite function, is best represented by one of the following graphs. So if we reason through this particular problem, if we have f of g of x, if we plug 0 into g, so if we do g of 0, that's going to equal 0. So f of g of 0 is simply equal to f of 0, and looking at the graph, f of 0 is still 0. So we need this graph to go through the origin, which means we can actually eliminate d. Once we've done that, we need to look at some of the other features of the graph. So in green, if we put positive x values in, and we first put them into g, we actually get negative y values out. So when we get negative y values out of g that we then feed into f, we'll actually get this part of the graph just here reflected over the y-axis. And it may not be quite as steep. We don't really know what the gradient of those straight lines are for g of x, but what we're trying to describe is that f of g of x is going to essentially have this branch of the graph out here. And when we put negative x values into g, we get negative y values out. So again, depending on how that gradient of g, depending on how big it is, we may get a bit of the graph that might be not quite as steep if we kind of treat this as being drawn a little bit to scale. So this blue graph that I've just drawn is actually a version of, or a prediction of, y equals f of g of x. So the only one that matches up with that is part E. So that's the correct answer for this question. From the examiner's report, we can see that 37% of students got this question correct, so it did challenge students in this exam. An excerpt from the examiner's report goes through a similar process to what we just went through. It identified that it needed to go through the origin, or that the point 0, 0 belongs on that composite function, and it also talked about that g of x was negative everywhere else, so that f of x was the positive part of the original graph everywhere else as well. So their steps there essentially match what we discussed on the previous slide.